The house at the end of Fallbrook Lane had been empty for 23 years. At least, that's what everyone in town believed. Mason Porter slowed his car as he approached the end of Fallbrook Lane, the rental agent's directions echoing in his mind. The pavement had given way to gravel half a mile back, and now even that was thinning out to rutted dirt. Towering oaks and maples created a canopy overhead, their branches interlocking like gnarled fingers across the sky. Dappled sunlight fought its way through, creating shifting patterns on his windshield that made him blink to maintain focus. "End of the road. Can't miss it," the agent had said, with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Big Victorian place. Needs some TLC, but the price reflects that. Keys are under the flower pot on the porch. Take your time looking around and call me when you're done." What she hadn't mentioned was how isolated it would be. Mason hadn't passed another house for nearly 2 miles, and the forest pressed in close on both sides of the narrow lane. He checked his phone. No service. Perfect. Just what he needed for focusing on his novel. The trees finally gave way to reveal a clearing, and there it stood. A sprawling 3-story Victorian with a wraparound porch and a tower room jutting from one corner. Despite the obvious disrepair, peeling paint, a sagging gutter, shutters hanging at odd angles, it was exactly what he'd been looking for. Isolation, atmosphere, a place where his characters could come alive without the distractions of his previous life in the city. Mason parked his Subaru in front of the house and stepped out, stretching his legs after the 3-hour drive from Boston. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, with an underlying mustiness that suggested years of neglect. Somewhere, a bird called out, the sound echoing strangely in the clearing. As he approached the front steps, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced up at the windows, half expecting to see a face peering down at him, but there was nothing except reflections of clouds sliding across dirty glass. Still, something made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Just nerves, he told himself. It's a big change moving from the city to the middle of nowhere. The porch steps creaked under his weight, and he found the flower pot exactly where the agent had said it would be. A cracked ceramic thing with long-dead remains of some plant still clinging to the dried soil. The key was underneath, tarnished and heavy in his palm. The lock resisted at first, then gave way with a reluctant groan. The door swung inward, revealing a dim foyer with a grand staircase ascending into darkness. Mason stepped inside, the floorboards protesting beneath his feet. "Hello?" he called out, though he knew the house was empty. His voice seemed to fade unnaturally quickly, as if the air itself had swallowed the sound. The musty smell was stronger inside, mingled with the sense of old wood and something else, something sharper, that reminded him vaguely of copper. Mason fumbled for a light switch, finding one beside the door. To his surprise, the chandelier overhead flickered to life, illuminating a space that time seemed to have forgotten. Faded wallpaper, with an intricate pattern of vines and flowers, clung to the walls. A side table held a tarnished silver bowl, and a grandfather clock stood silent sentinel beside the staircase, its hands frozen at 3:47. There was furniture draped with sheets, ghostly forms that loomed in the corners of his vision. Mason set down his overnight bag and began to explore, mentally noting repairs that would be needed if he decided to rent the place. The living room to the right of the foyer was spacious, with a stone fireplace and large windows overlooking what might once have been a garden, but was now an overgrown tangle of weeds and brambles. A formal dining room led to a kitchen that still had appliances from at least the 1980s, with yellowed linoleum and faded curtains. Surprisingly, when he tested the faucet, rusty water spluttered, then ran clear. The rental agent had mentioned that utilities were still connected, which seemed odd for a house that had been vacant for so long. As Mason wandered from room to room on the first floor, he couldn't shake the sense of being followed. Several times he turned quickly, half expecting to catch someone or something lurking behind him. But there was never anything there except dust motes dancing in the beams of light that managed to penetrate the grimy windows. By the time he reached the library at the back of the house, Mason was feeling more settled. The room was lined with empty shelves, perfect for his collection of reference books and first editions. A bay window offered a view of the woods behind the property, and he could imagine himself writing at a desk placed just there, drawing inspiration from the ancient trees. This could work, he thought. It needs cleaning and updating, but the bones are good. The house creaked around him, settling. Outside, the light was beginning to fade as afternoon gave way to evening. Mason decided to check the upstairs before darkness fell completely. The grand staircase curved elegantly upward, each step emitting a different pitched groan as he ascended. At the top, a long corridor stretched in both directions, with doors leading to what he assumed were bedrooms and bathrooms. The first room he entered was clearly the master bedroom, spacious, with tall windows, and an adjoining bathroom with a claw-foot tub. The bed frame remained, though the mattress was long gone. A dressing table stood in one corner, its mirror clouded with age. Mason moved to the window and looked out at the front yard. From this angle, he could see the entire approach to the house, the dirt road winding away through the trees. Something moved at the edge of the forest. A deer, perhaps, or some other woodland creature. He squinted, trying to make it out, but it was gone. As he turned from the window, his gaze fell on the mirror of the dressing table. For a split second, he could have sworn he saw someone standing behind him, a tall, thin figure with its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Mason whirled around, heart pounding. The room was empty. "Get it together," he muttered to himself. "Old houses play tricks with the light, The next few bedrooms were smaller, but similarly appointed, each with period-appropriate furniture left behind by the previous owners. One room had clearly belonged to a child, with faded circus animals still visible on the wallpaper, and a small wooden rocking horse in the corner. Mason approached the horse, running his fingers over its mane, worn smooth by years of small hands. As he touched it, the horse began to rock gently, though there was no breeze in the room. He snatched his hand back, telling himself it was just the uneven floorboards causing the movement. But he backed out of the room quickly nonetheless, pulling the door firmly shut behind him. At the end of the hall was the door to the tower room he'd seen from outside. It was locked. Mason tried the key from the front door, but it didn't fit. Making a mental note to ask the agent about it, he turned back toward the stairs. That was when he heard it, a soft thud from somewhere below, as if a door had closed. Mason froze, listening intently. The house was silent again, but he couldn't shake the certainty that he'd heard something. "Hello?" he called out. "Is someone there? I'm viewing the property." No response came, but as he descended the staircase, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The front door, which he was certain he'd closed behind him, now stood wide open. The rational part of his mind suggested that it might not have latched properly, that a gust of wind could have blown it open. But he couldn't remember any wind, and the day had been still. Mason approached the door cautiously and peered outside. His car sat exactly where he'd left it. Nothing moved in the gathering twilight. After a moment's hesitation, he closed the door firmly, making sure it latched this time. As darkness fell, the house seemed to close in around him. Mason found himself checking and double-checking rooms he'd already explored, unable to shake the feeling that something had changed since he'd last seen them. In the dining room, he could have sworn that one of the chairs had been pulled away from the table. In the library, a book that hadn't been there before lay open on the floor. These inconsistencies gnawed at him, but each time he tried to focus on what exactly was wrong, the certainty slipped away like water through his fingers. By the time he returned to the foyer, night had fallen completely. The chandelier cast long shadows that danced across the walls as if they had lives of their own. Outside, the forest was a wall of impenetrable darkness. Mason checked his watch. Almost 9 p.m. He'd been exploring for hours without realizing it. He should call the rental agent, let her know he'd finished looking around. But his phone still showed no service. The landline he'd spotted in the kitchen would likely be disconnected after all these years. A shiver ran down his spine as he realized he was effectively cut off from the outside world. He'd told the agent he might stay overnight to get a feel for the place, and she hadn't seemed concerned. But now, standing in the foyer of this massive, empty house as night pressed against the windows, the prospect seemed far less appealing than it had earlier. "Don't be ridiculous," he told himself. "It's just an old house. You wanted isolation, and now you've got it. Decision made. Mason retrieved his overnight bag from where he'd left it and climbed the stairs to the master bedroom. He had a sleeping bag, some snacks, and a bottle of water. He'd be fine for one night. As he spread his sleeping bag on the bare floor, there was no way he was sleeping in the dusty, antique bed frame. Mason tried to focus on the positive aspects of the house. The size was perfect. The location, while remote, was exactly the peace and quiet he needed to finish his novel. The price was well within his budget, especially considering the square footage. But those practical considerations kept being interrupted by nagging doubts and the persistent feeling that he wasn't alone. Mason pulled out his notebook and tried to work on his novel's outline, hoping the familiar task would calm his nerves. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself sketching the house, his pencil tracing the outline of the tower room, the windows like eyes watching him. Eventually, exhaustion overtook him. Mason crawled into his sleeping bag, using his duffel bag as a pillow, and closed his eyes. The house creaked and settled around him, a symphony of small sounds that his mind couldn't help but interpret as footsteps, whispers, the gentle opening and closing of distant doors. Just the house settling, he told himself again and again, until he finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. Mason dreamed of corridors that stretched beyond possibility, of doors that opened onto other doors, of windows that showed impossible landscapes. He dreamed of standing in the tower room, looking out at a town that had never existed, watching as shadowy figures moved through streets that twisted back on themselves like knots. And he dreamed of something watching him from the corner of every room he entered, something tall and thin that moved only when he wasn't looking directly at it. He woke with a start, disoriented in the darkness. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was, and panic clawed at his throat. Then his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the windows, and he remembered the old house at the end of Fallbrook Lane. Something had woken him. A sound, a presence. Mason lay perfectly still, listening. Thud, thud, thud. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the stairs. Mason's heart hammered against his ribs. The footsteps weren't the random creaks of an old house settling. They were purposeful, rhythmic, ascending one step at a time with measured precision. He sat up, eyes fixed on the bedroom door, which he'd left ajar. The hallway beyond was pitch black, but the footsteps continued their steady approach. Thud, thud, thud. They reached the top of the stairs and paused. Then, slowly, they began to move down the hallway toward his room. Mason scrambled for his phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the bedroom door and a slice of the hallway beyond. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, nothing moved. Mason held his breath, the phone clutched so tightly in his hand that his knuckles turned white. Then, slowly, something began to eclipse the thin strip of darkness visible through the doorway. A shadow, deeper than the surrounding night. Without thinking, Mason lunged forward and slammed the door shut, turning the old-fashioned key in the lock with trembling fingers. He backed away, the flashlight beam dancing wildly across the walls as his hand shook. From the other side of the door came a soft sound, the gentle scrape of fingernails against wood. Not knocking, not pounding, just a slow, deliberate scratching, as if whatever was out there had all the time in the world. Mason pressed his back against the far wall, unable to take his eyes off the door. The scratching continued, unhurried, almost contemplative. Then, just as abruptly as it had begun, it stopped. Silence descended, broken only by his ragged breathing and the thunder of his heart. Minutes passed. Outside, clouds must have passed over the moon, because the room grew darker still. Mason kept the flashlight trained on the door, watching for any movement of the handle, any shadow passing beneath. Nothing happened. Eventually, his racing heart began to slow, and rational thought reasserted itself. Had he imagined it? Dreams could be vivid, and the boundary between sleep and wakefulness wasn't always clear. Perhaps he'd still been dreaming when he heard the footsteps, the scratching. Except his sleeping bag was across the room, and the door was indeed closed and locked, though he had no memory of closing it before falling asleep. Mason checked his watch. 3:47 a.m., the same time that had been frozen on the grandfather clock downstairs. A coincidence, surely, but one that sent another shiver down his spine. He knew he wouldn't be able to go back to sleep. The thought of lying in darkness, listening for sounds in the hall, was unbearable. Instead, he sat with his back against the wall, the flashlight in his lap, and waited for dawn. As the first gray light of morning seeped through the windows, Mason finally allowed himself to relax slightly. Whatever had happened during the night, real or imagined, seemed less threatening in the gathering daylight. He stood, muscles stiff from hours of sitting on the hard floor, and approached the door. After a moment's hesitation, he unlocked it and pulled it open. The hallway was empty. Mason exhaled shakily and stepped out, looking both ways down the corridor. Nothing seemed out of place. The doors to the other bedrooms were closed just as he'd left them. The staircase descended into the foyer, which was visible in the dim morning light filtering through the windows. I must have been dreaming, he thought. Or the house has me on edge, making me jumpy at every little noise. Deciding to skip any further exploration in favor of getting back to civilization, Mason quickly packed up his sleeping bag and gathered his belongings. As he was about to leave the master bedroom, something caught his eye. A fine white powder on the floor in front of the door. He knelt down to examine it. Plaster dust. Looking up, he noticed 4 long scratches in the door, as if something with sharp nails had dragged its fingers down the wood. Mason's mouth went dry. He backed away, almost tripping over his bag in his haste to put distance between himself and the door. What he'd heard in the night had been real. In the growing light, he noticed something else. A small trail of the same white plaster dust leading from his door, down the hallway, toward the locked tower room. Against his better judgment, Mason followed the trail. It led directly to the tower room door, then stopped. He tried the handle again, still locked. "Who was in there?" he called out, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice. "I know someone's here." No answer came, but as he pressed his ear to the door, he thought he could hear something. A soft, rhythmic sound, like breathing. Or perhaps it was just the wind, finding its way through cracks in the old windows. Mason stepped back from the door, mind racing. He needed to leave, to get back to his car and drive away from this place. But a growing sense of indignation was competing with his fear. This was supposed to be a simple house viewing, and someone was playing tricks on him. The rental agent? Some local kids who used the abandoned house as their playground? "This isn't funny," he said loudly. "I'm leaving now, and I'm going to report this to the rental company." As if in response, something heavy thudded against the tower room door from the inside, making it rattle in its frame. Then again, harder this time, as if something was throwing itself against the wood. Mason didn't wait to see if the door would hold. He turned and ran, taking the stairs 2 at a time, his overnight bag clutched to his chest. Behind him, the pounding continued, growing more frenzied, as if whatever was trapped in the tower room sensed his escape. At the bottom of the stairs, Mason skidded to a halt. The front door was closed and chained from the inside. A heavy iron chain that he was certain hadn't been there the night before was threaded through an ornate hasp, secured with an antique padlock. The pounding from upstairs had stopped, replaced by the sound of a door opening, then slow, deliberate footsteps on the landing. Mason dropped his bag and frantically pulled at the chain, but the padlock held firm. He could try to find another exit. Surely there was a back door through the kitchen, but that would mean moving deeper into the house, away from the safety of his car just outside. The footsteps had reached the top of the stairs now. They paused, as if whatever was making them was looking down at him, savoring his panic. With no other choice, Mason raced toward the kitchen, hoping to find another way out. The footsteps began their descent, unhurried, confident. The kitchen was just as he'd left it. Early morning light casting long shadows across the yellowed linoleum. A door beside the refrigerator led outside, but when Mason tried it, he found it nailed shut from the outside. The windows were similarly secured, boards crisscrossing them in a haphazard pattern that he was certain hadn't been there during his exploration the previous day. Thud, thud, Thud. The footsteps had reached the bottom of the stairs. They paused again, then began moving toward the kitchen. Mason looked around frantically, searching for a weapon, an escape route, anything. His eyes fell on a cellar door in the floor, its iron ring pull partially hidden by a faded rug. Without thinking, he yanked it open, revealing a set of steep wooden stairs descending into darkness. The footsteps were in the dining room now, just one room away. In seconds, whatever was making them would reach the kitchen. With no other choice, Mason lowered himself into the cellar, pulling the door shut above him, just as a shadow fell across the kitchen threshold. Darkness enveloped him, absolute and smothering. He fumbled for his phone to activate the flashlight, terrified that even that small illumination might somehow reveal his hiding place. The flashlight cast a weak glow over rough stone walls and a dirt floor. The cellar was small, barely the footprint of the kitchen above, with a low ceiling supported by massive wooden beams. Shelves lined one wall, holding dusty mason jars filled with unidentifiable substances. A workbench stood against another wall, tools hanging above it, hammers, saws, what looked like butchering equipment. Mason held his breath, listening. Above him, floorboards creaked as something moved across the kitchen. It seemed to be searching, pacing back and forth. Then the creaking stopped directly above the cellar door. Seconds stretched into minutes. Mason remained frozen, afraid that the slightest movement would give him away. His flashlight beam trembled in his shaking hand, casting unsettling shadows across the cellar walls. Finally, the footsteps moved away, receding back toward the dining room, then the foyer. Mason exhaled shakily, allowing himself to breathe again. But he didn't move from his hiding place. Whatever was up there might be waiting for him to emerge. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, Mason began to notice details about the cellar that he'd missed at first glance. The dirt floor wasn't uniform. There were areas where it appeared to have been disturbed, rectangular sections that looked almost like graves. The realization hit him with such force that he nearly dropped his phone. There were at least 3 distinct rectangular areas where the earth had been dug up and then tamped back down. Mason's horrified gaze traveled from the disturbed earth to the workbench, where what he'd taken for butchering equipment now revealed itself in a more sinister light. Not tools for preparing meat, but implements of a darker purpose. Surgical instruments, their once gleaming surfaces now dulled with age, and something darker that might have been dried blood. What kind of house had he stumbled into? And more importantly, how was he going to escape? The cellar had no obvious exit other than the door to the kitchen above. Mason would have to go back the way he came and find another route out of the house. But first, he needed to know what he was dealing with, whether his unseen stalker was still nearby. Gathering his courage, Mason slowly silently climbed the steps leading up to the cellar door. He pressed his ear against the rough wood, listening intently. The house seemed quiet now, but that didn't mean he was alone. Whatever had been stalking him could be waiting silently, just as he was. After several minutes with no sound, Mason decided to risk opening the door, just enough to peek into the kitchen. He pushed up gently, wincing at the slight creak of hinges. The kitchen was empty, bathed in the gray light of early morning. Nothing moved in his limited field of vision. Emboldened, Mason pushed the door open further and raised himself up until he could see the entire room. Still, nothing. The doorway to the dining room beyond was a black rectangle, revealing nothing of what might lie in wait. Mason climbed out of the cellar, careful to lower the door silently back into place. Every nerve in his body was screaming at him to run, but he forced himself to move cautiously, placing each foot with deliberate care to avoid creaking floorboards. The dining room was similarly deserted, the sheet-draped furniture looming like pale ghosts in the dim light. Mason edged his way toward the foyer, keeping his back to the wall, senses hyper-alert for any sign of movement or sound. The foyer came into view, and with it, the front door, still chained shut. But Mason's attention was drawn upward, to the landing at the top of the stairs. There, silhouetted against the window at the end of the upstairs hall, stood a figure. It was unnaturally tall and thin, its proportions subtly wrong in ways that Mason's mind couldn't quite process. Its head was cocked at an angle that would be impossible for a human neck to support, and its arms hung at its sides, too long, fingers nearly touching the floor. As Mason watched, frozen in horror, the figure's head slowly rotated toward him, though its body remained facing the window. There was a wet sound, like tearing cartilage, as its neck twisted further than any human neck could turn. Its face was in shadow, but Mason could make out the gleam of eyes watching him, and what might have been a mouth spreading into a smile that stretched too wide. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then the figure took a step toward the stairs, its movement jerky, almost mechanical, like a marionette being pulled by unseen strings. Mason broke from his paralysis and ran, not toward the chained front door, but toward the library at the back of the house. He had noticed windows there, large ones that overlooked the backyard. If he could break one, he might be able to escape. Behind him, the figure descended the stairs with unnatural speed, those two long limbs carrying it in a scuttling motion that was more insect than human. Mason didn't look back, focusing only on reaching the library before the thing caught him. He burst through the library doors and slammed them shut behind him. Looking frantically for something to barricade them with. A heavy bookcase stood nearby, and with strength born of desperation, Mason heaved it across the floor, positioning it in front of the doors just as something slammed into them from the other side. The impact was so violent that the bookcase shuddered, nearly toppling over. It wouldn't hold for long. Mason turned to the windows, heart sinking as he saw they too had been boarded up sometime during the night. But the boards looked hastily applied, nailed in at odd angles. There might be a chance. Behind him, another crash against the doors, stronger this time. The bookcase scraped a few inches across the floor. Desperate, Mason grabbed a heavy brass lamp from a nearby table and began smashing it against the boards covering the closest window. The aged wood splintered, but held. He struck again, harder, putting all his weight behind the blow. A third crash against the library doors. The bookcase moved further, and Mason could see the doors beginning to buckle inward, wood splintering around the hinges. With a final, frenzied effort, Mason struck at the window boards again. They gave way with a crack, revealing the window beneath. Without hesitation, he brought the lamp down on the glass, which shattered outward in a shower of crystalline shards. The doors behind him exploded inward, the bookcase toppling like a felled tree. Mason didn't look back. He scrambled through the broken window, feeling glass slice into his palms as he pulled himself through. He landed hard on the overgrown grass outside, the breath knocked from his lungs. But terror gave him no time to recover. He scrambled to his feet and ran, heading for the tree line, away from the house, away from the thing that had almost caught him. Only when he reached the shelter of the trees did Mason dare to look back. The house stood silhouetted against the brightening sky, its windows like vacant eyes staring after him. In the broken library window through which he'd escaped, a figure stood watching. That same unnaturally tall, thin silhouette, its head still cocked at that impossible angle. Even from this distance, Mason could feel its gaze on him, patient and hungry, as if it knew something he didn't. Without waiting to see what it might do next, Mason plunged deeper into the forest, determined to find his way back to the main road by circling around the property. He'd left everything behind: his overnight bag, his notes, even his car keys. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was getting as far away from that house as possible. It took him nearly 2 hours of stumbling through underbrush before he reached the main road, his clothes torn, hands bloody from the broken glass and brambles. A passing truck driver took pity on him, though the man clearly had doubts about Mason's wild-eyed explanation of getting lost in the woods. At the nearest town, Mason went straight to the local police station, his story pouring out in a frantic jumble. The house, the locked tower room, the thing that had chased him, the disturbed earth in the cellar that looked like graves. The officers exchanged glances as he talked, their expressions shifting from concern to skepticism. When he'd finished, one of them, an older man with deep lines etched around his eyes, cleared his throat. "Mr. Porter, that house has been empty for over 20 years, ever since the Miller family disappeared. There have been stories about it being haunted, but nothing more than small-town gossip. We've checked it out numerous times. It's just an old abandoned property." "But I was there," Mason insisted. "I spoke to a rental agent. She gave me the key." Another exchanged glance between the officers. The older one spoke again, more gently this time. "Sir, there is no rental agent. That house isn't on the market. It's been tied up in legal disputes since the Millers vanished. No one's had legal access to it for years." It took several more hours of questioning. A call to Mason's publisher to confirm his identity. And finally, a reluctant agreement to send officers to check out the house before Mason was allowed to leave the station. They clearly thought he was either lying or delusional, but they promised to investigate and recover his car and belongings. Mason checked into the only motel in town, exhaustion washing over him in waves. He showered, bandaged his cuts as best he could, and fell into a dreamless sleep almost as soon as his head hit the pillow. He was awakened by a knock at his door late that afternoon. It was the younger of the two officers he'd spoken to earlier. "We checked out the house," the officer said without preamble. "Found your car, but no sign of forced entry or anyone living there. The place was dusty, looked like no one had been inside for years. No chain on the front door, no boards on the windows, and no cellar that we could find." Mason stared at him in disbelief. "That's not possible. I was there. I spent the night there." The officer held out a plastic bag containing Mason's car keys and overnight bag. "We found these in your car, which was unlocked. The rental agent you mentioned? We made some calls. There's no record of anyone by that name working for any real estate agency in the county." "Then who gave me the key? Who told me about the house?" The officer just shook his head. "Can't answer that, sir. But the house is secure now, and your car's parked outside the motel. You're free to go whenever you're ready." After the officer left, Mason sat on the edge of the bed, trying to make sense of what he'd been told. Had he imagined the whole thing? A vivid dream, perhaps, or some kind of psychological break. But his injuries were real, and he knew what he'd experienced. The house at the end of Fallbrook Lane was not empty, no matter what the police said. Something lived there. Something that had nearly caught him. Something that might still be watching from those windows, waiting for the next visitor to come looking for isolation and quiet. Mason checked out of the motel that evening and drove straight back to Boston, not stopping except for gas. He never wrote about the house, never told anyone else about what had happened there. But sometimes, in his dreams, he still finds himself in that tower room, looking out at a town that never existed, while something tall and thin watches from the corner, its head cocked at an impossible angle, waiting for him to look away. The house at the end of Fallbrook Lane remains empty to this day. At least, that's what everyone in town believes. But sometimes, late at night, lights can be seen moving from window to window, as if someone or something is searching for something lost. And occasionally, travelers passing by report seeing a man standing at an upstairs window, his neck bent at an impossible angle, watching the road with hungry eyes. Those who know the stories avoid Fallbrook Lane after dark. They say that whatever lives in that house is patient and clever, and that it knows how to lure the perfect visitors to its door. Creative souls seeking isolation, seeking inspiration, seeking a place where their characters can come alive. The rental listing still appears occasionally online, though it vanishes whenever anyone investigates too closely. A charming Victorian at the end of a quiet lane, perfect for writers or artists seeking solitude. Needs some TLC, but the price reflects that. Keys under the flower pot on the porch. Take your time looking around. You might never want to leave.